Greetings everyone, this is Isrix9900. It's hard to believe it, but Christmas has indeed already come and gone. And some of you probably got a new console as a Christmas present, and I bet that you are very, very happy with it. Unless you got one of these things. This, I believe, is called the Game Light, if I remember correctly. Either way, it's a Chinese rip-off Game Boy. And it's about as awful as you would think, given what I just told you this very moment. So why do I even have this piece of shit, you might ask? Well, the truth is, this wasn't even meant to be given to me. As this was actually originally given to my mom by one of her coworkers. And obviously, she doesn't want it, as she doesn't even play video games. So while we were unwrapping presents Christmas morning, she at first gave it to my sister, who then gave it to me. So I have been screwing around with this thing just to see how bad this actually is. And oh my god, this thing is so freaking bad that I was laughing about it when I was originally trying it. Truth be told, I wasn't even originally going to make a video about this thing, but then I showed it to my friends from the One Shitty Family podcast, and Lori was the one that said that I should make a video about this. And when she said that, I was like, you're so right. So that's why I still have this, as I wanted to make this video to absolutely roast the crap out of this thing, because I can't get over how bad this thing is. It's not even bad in the sense that it's so bad it's good. It's comically bad. So don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And let's start roasting the crap out of this thing, because oh boy, do I have some thoughts on this device. Alright, and here it is in all of its bright red, cheap looking flesh. Alright, so obviously this definitely looks very much like a Game Boy, if you couldn't tell already. And yet, size is actually not this device's biggest downside. It's actually a little bit smaller than the Game Boy Pocket. So, yeah, the Game Boy Pocket is actually a little bit taller, and this device is even a little bit thinner than the Game Boy Pocket, but not by much. We're only talking like 2 or 3, maybe 4 millimeters at best. So, and it's also, it's very, very, very light. Almost too light. Now, normally, a light-feeling handheld would be a good thing, because, you know, that would be easier to carry around, and this thing is actually very pocket-friendly. Like, I could definitely toss it into my pocket and barely feel it, but I feel like this thing being so light is also a detriment, because this thing feels so hollow. It's very cheap feeling. Very cheap feeling plastic. It makes the freaking 2DS feel high quality. So obviously, compared to something like a Game Boy Pocket or even a Game Boy Color, these also, these are also made of plastic, but these feel like much higher quality products, despite both of these coming from the 90s, whereas this thing is, from the 2020s. Another thing to note about the plastic on this device is that the front here has a different texture compared to the plastic along the back, and for some reason the middle has this ribbed pattern. It doesn't really help with ergonomics or grip at all, so I don't understand why they did that. I guess to give it a little bit of flair, but I don't know. It feels weird. Very weird. And it's also, of course, where the battery compartment goes, and the good news is that it does use a rechargeable battery, and the capacity is actually pretty decent, as it's a 1020 milliamp hour battery. But I have not used this thing for long enough to know what the battery life of this device is, so I can't tell. So I can't really say if it's any good or not in terms of battery life, because this thing is just so fucking garbage that I don't even want to use it for that long. But yeah, getting back to the build quality, it's got this weird looking texture along the front here. It's not found on the back. So I don't understand. Like, it doesn't really help much in terms of the overall feel of the device. It just feels different, but yeah, very hollow, cheap feeling plastic. And the screen, it looks like it's got a bad screen cover, and it likely does, but it's also because, you know, this is a, I think this is just a protective film that they applied to the screen cover to protect it from scratching during shipping. Let me see. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not even going to try to bother because if this isn't some kind of cheap screen protector, then I could very well just damage this thing. So I'm just gonna leave it applied for the sake of this video. And another thing that you'll also notice about this screen, speaking of, is actually the aspect ratio, as unlike the Game Boy and Game Boy Color that use a 10:9 aspect ratio, or the Game Boy Advance that use a 3:2 aspect ratio, instead the Game Boy goes for, this looks 4:3 because it's definitely wider than the square aspect ratio of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but not quite as wide as the Game Boy Advance, for example. It's also not quite as tall either. But yeah, this is a smaller screen than even the Game Boy Pocket, despite the fact that this is smaller than the Game Boy Pocket. And the Game Boy Color has a slightly taller screen, but it's not quite as wide. But that's mainly because, despite being a device that looks like the Game Boy, it actually doesn't play any Game Boy games. We'll get to that. And of course, the other big difference you see here are the controls, as we have both the D-pad and 4 face buttons, as opposed to the D-pad and 2 face buttons of pretty much any Game Boy, outside of, you know, the Game Boy Advance that has the shoulder buttons. But yeah, we have 4 face buttons on the Game Boy, and the X and Y buttons are completely unnecessary, as all the games on here are pirated NES games. And of course, NES games were never designed with 4 face buttons in mind. And wait until you see what they did to the button mapping for all the games, because it's it's quite the story to tell. Now, we do have a mono speaker on the front, and the speaker actually does get quite loud. I don't really care about the speaker quality though, because yeah. Anyway, we got our volume wheel right here, and it's got quite a lot of resistance compared to like the volume dial on, say, the Game Boy Color, which is very easy to just flick to increase the volume, but not the case here on the Game Boy. Also, it's much further down along the side too, as you can tell right here. I definitely think the Game Boy Color, as well as the Game Boy Light, have a better placement for the volume dial, because when I'm holding this thing, it does kind of get in the way. But fortunately, because of how much resistance it has, it ends up actually working out, because I don't find myself accidentally adjusting the volume because of just how much resistance this thing has. Come on, focus. There we go. And the right side is completely clean, so there's no contrast dial like on the Game Boy or Game Boy Pocket, and no power switch on that side either, unlike the Game Boy Color. Instead, the power switch is found along the top here, much like the Game Boy and Game Boy Pocket, but of course, the Game Boy and Game Boy Pocket put it on the left corner as opposed to the right corner of the Game Light, as I don't know why they did that. We have our micro USB charging port along the center here, and it actually doubles for, it has data connectivity capabilities too. We'll get to that. And this looks to be the headphone jack, but it is not actually. This is video out, and the size of this connector is actually smaller too, because if you bring up like the Game Boy Color, you see it's smaller than the more conventional headphone jack is. This is a 2.5 millimeter connector, as opposed to the 3.5 millimeter jack of a more conventional headphone jack. And instead of using HDMI like any modern console, instead it still uses AV out. And to make matters worse,
It's mono audio. So we just have the red and yellow cables as opposed to the red, yellow, and white cables of AV out with stereo audio. So we just have a one speaker, and yeah, see that very tiny 2.5 millimeter jack that plugs in right there. And also this cable is really short, so that's already a problem. But of course, trying to use this thing with a monitor TV is an absolute bitch. And that's because most TVs nowadays don't even have AV in, so you're going to need an older TV if you want to get video out on this doohickey. Now, I did mention that the micro USB port can double duty, and that's because this device also ships with an external controller. And, yeah, they could even match the same shade of red. This one is a much deeper red, while this one is a more orangey red. And same face button layout, but yeah, it's also really, really, really cheap. Maybe even more so. It almost feels like it has some flex to this thing too. It's pretty bad. And yes, let's address the elephant in the room. They did rip off the Famicom controller for this thing. And notice how it's labeled as Player 2. For those who don't know, the Famicom controllers actually were slightly different depending on which player that you were playing as. As this is copying the Player 1 controller from the Famicom, as the Player 2 one does not have start and select, instead has a microphone. But again, 4 face buttons on this controller, just like the game like itself, when all we're playing are NES games, which don't use 4 face buttons. And what's kind of crappy is that Player 1 can't use this controller as their own controller, while this thing is hooked up to the TV. And that's because, again, this is only used for Player 2. So, if you want to do some 2-player multiplayer, you kind of have to either make Player 2 lean over your shoulder to see the absolutely tiny screen, or hope you have an older TV that still has AV in to play games that way. And you still got to use the built-in controls on this device, as there's only room for 1 controller connector. So Player 1 has to deal with the tiny feeling buttons and whatnot on the gameway itself, while Player 2 gets a much more spacious controller, and one that arguably feels better. But still, this controller, holy crap, this thing is so cheaply made. Like I said, it feels really flimsy, but like, I mean, look at just, yeah, see how much this top face button moves when I just press this one? That's not what's supposed to happen. And this D-pad is just, it's so mushy. There's no tactile feedback at all. It's got an okay rolling motion, but even the start and select button, like, and that's because this controller, I actually did take this controller apart just to see how badly made this thing is. And turns out, all the buttons share one membrane. Yeah, and even the PCB underneath didn't seem to have good alignment. I'll show some pictures on screen of what the underside of this controller looks like, but yeah, it's bad. It's very bad. Also, the cable comes out of the right side of this controller instead of like from the top, like any conventional wired controller would do so. It's so weird. At least these face buttons have an okay amount of tactile feedback, but even so, these still feel like absolute garbage. Like, let's take a listen to some face buttons from other controllers and a couple of handhelds. Yeah, pretty garbage controller, all things considered. And yet, despite all of that, this still actually feels better to use than the inputs on the Game Boy itself, because holy fuck, these buttons are the worst I've ever felt on any gaming device, period. It is so baffling bad at how awful these buttons feel. They have no tactility, they're very mushy, and it requires such an insane amount of pressure to push down, to the point where my thumbs feel absolutely tired and almost sore because of how hard I need to mash down these buttons to get them to register. It's baffling. Like, this D-pad is also just feels very flat, even more so than the D-pad that's already on the controller. And like, this already wasn't a great D-pad to begin with, but this D-pad suddenly looks amazing compared to the D-pad on the Game Boy itself. It's very uncomfortable and just absolutely ruins the entire experience because of just how hard you need to mash these fuckers to just do anything in a game. It's ridiculous. The start and select buttons at least feel pretty good. They have some form of tactility. I kind of wish all the other buttons feel this okay. And then this button right here, that's the reset button. Just press that, and it'll just reset the entire system. And yes, it's a very clicky button, but again, very cheap. Now, getting back to the screen, because I actually did not talk about the screen quality itself, but the big advantage that this screen has, and really the only big advantage that this has compared to like the Game Boy Color or Game Boy Pocket, is the fact that this is a backlit display that has okay brightness. It is playable in the dark, and even in this brightly lit room, it's still plenty visible, but the screen quality is still pretty bad. Not even because of the size, because like the freaking Game Boy Micro has a smaller screen, but it's mainly because of the colors and also the viewing angles. Although I believe the colors are more have to do with the emulation quality, which we will get to in a moment. But the viewing angles are just horrendous. Let me turn the volume down so we can just take a look here. Also gives you an idea of what the interface looks like, and yeah, I think you already start to see the problem of what we're dealing with here. Yep, here's a preview of what we get to deal with as I stutter. But yeah, watch when I tilt the screen to the left. It starts washing out. Now if I tilt it to the right, it starts washing out. So if I tilt it like this, it actually does retain the quality. And same goes if I go this way. So it's really only the horizontal viewing angles that are bad, while the vertical angles are actually pretty okay. But this screen cover is also very reflective. So you can be seeing a lot of reflections. Like, there's me hunching down over my phone just to get this footage, and my neck is sore. You're welcome. So now I think we should take a look at some games, because, oh boy, is the experience on here interesting. Let's turn it back on. Yeah. Apparently this thing touts it has 400 games built in. Now, of course, all of these are pirated NES ROMs with a bunch of bootleg shit. So you got all your typical stuff like Super Mario Brothers. We got Super Mario Brothers 3 on here, Dr. Mario, Mario Brothers. We got Contra on here. We got Balloon Fight, NES Baseball, and Bomberman, I guess, Clue-Clue-Land. But okay, maybe turn on the volume. So they claim that this has 400 games in one, when this is deceptive. Whoa, angle change. I just had to adjust the set a little bit because I was getting too sore from hunching over that long. But yeah, like I said, they claim that this has 400 games in one. But this is, again, deceptive. That's because I feel like this is inflated because you got all these pirated NES games, but a bunch of random garbage just all over this place. A lot of games I've never even heard of. Like, what the hell was Bomb Sweeper? Brush Roller? Shack and Pop? What the fuck is that? And of course, a lot of you probably saw Mario 14. Like, what the hell is this game? But also, there are a couple of repeats on here. What's a good example? Load Runner. Actually, that's a good example. So, I haven't seen the entire list. I'm gonna be transparent about that. So, I was, first of all, going backwards to see what other games were on here. And I see Load Runner. And then I scroll this way. And I think it was on the next page. Yeah, there's Load Runner again. So that's 2 times I saw Load Runner. And yeah, there is just a lot of garbage installed on here. Just a lot of stuff I've never even heard of. Some of which I did hear of, but also like some of these are actually just ROM hacks of other games that you may or may not have heard of. In fact, let's go back to Mario 14, because actually is a good example of games in here that are ROM hacks. Okay, so I booted up Mario 14, and yeah, copyright 1993 Wario, apparently. Yeah, I have no idea what this game is even being... I have no idea what this game is meant to be a hack of. But yeah. I have no idea what this game is. Just cry... Oh, fucking hell. Ah! Trying to play through the viewfinder is not pleasant. Anyway, this actually is a good time to talk about the controls, because they're not what you would think. So instead of just having to use A and B, instead, your real A and B buttons are actually Y as your B button and B as your main A button. So what the hell do X and A do? They're turbo buttons. That's it. So they changed the feel of a lot of games just because they wanted to have 4 face buttons, even though no NES games use these buttons. No NES games use 4 face buttons, is what I meant to say. Now, again, I have no idea what this game is meant to be a hack of, but I actually, you know what's sad? I recognize this game because I've seen this on a lot of other cheap handhelds like this.
Alright, post-production me here. A little bit of an update. I did do a little bit of digging into Super Mario 14, and I was right about this being a hack of an NES game. But turns out it's actually a hack of a Famicom game called, I hope I pronounced this right, Kaiketsu Yanshimaru 3 Taiketsu Zurigen. Never heard of this title, but then again, Japanese exclusive, so that's interesting. And I can't get over the quality of that game. There's an alternate version called Super Mario 15. Like, this would leave me down quite the rabbit hole if I did decide to investigate further, but I was so unimpressed with this game while we were looking at the gameplay that yeah. So if you were wondering about the origins of this game, here you go.
Also, yeah, like, I can't even get past this ledge in the first level, so this game is technically unplayable. Anyway, let's just reset, because, let's go to the first Super Mario Bros., because this is a good idea to show just how bad the emulation quality actually is on this device. I'm not sure how well it's coming through on camera, but the colors look off, and I'm not sure if they're using some kind of filter to change the look of the game, but like you can see the text at the top of the HUD here. It looks a little off, and you can see Mario's sprite also just looks a little wonky, and you also see that we have rounded corners on each side of the screen here, even though NES games were never made with these rounded corners in mind, and it's all because of this bezel. As if we tilt the screen, you can kind of see the actual edge of the screen sunk into the bezel. Yeah, you can kind of see it a little bit, and it does make the game it just makes playing games feel trippy for whatever reason. And also, another thing to note, there's noticeable tearing when playing a game like Super Mario Brothers. In fact, also the audio is just absolute garbage. Let's just take a listen here. Oh, God, just the sound is off pitch enough that it just drives me batshit crazy. Where's that fucking hidden one up? There it is. I totally didn't waste like 5 seconds trying to find that. Oh boy, let's see how well I do with these absolute buttons while mashing to... Okay, I actually did pretty okay. But yeah, the screen tearing is very, very noticeable. Fuck me. Yeah. This is not pleasant in the absolute slightest. Anyway, let's demonstrate the 2-player action on this, because it's weird and not in the good way. So we gotta... I can't get over the fact that this controller connects via micro USB instead of like USB-C, like any other modern handheld. So we're gonna plug it in. And there's no way to know if this controller has power or not, just because there's no LED on it. So I'm just going to go back to Super Mario Brothers, because that's like the easiest game to demonstrate. So I'm going to do a 2-player game, and I'm just going to intentionally die. Alright, so now it's player 2's turn. And yeah. And yeah, this controller actually does feel technically better to use, because, you know, I can't get over the crappy buttons on the game on itself, but I still would not rely on this controller to play anything for that matter. It technically gets the job done, but do you really want to deal with this? No, you don't, because it's fucking awful. I'm just gonna keep going until I die. Okay, even this D-pad is starting to get to me now. Like, I'm just messing up all kinds of inputs. Also, I'm looking at this screen from a very weird angle, because I don't want to bother with unwinding this controller cable just to get a better viewing angle. It's just... Okay, I've seen enough. I've seen enough. And you want to know how much worse I can make this? I can get a better experience playing Super Mario Brothers from a fucking Game & Watch. Yeah, a Game & Watch can play Super Mario Brothers better than this piece of shit. Like, what the hell? Like, it's got a way better D-pad, and even better feeling buttons, despite the fact that these buttons are made of rubber instead of the hard plastic. But the actual feel of the buttons themselves is way worse on this device compared to the Game & Watch. And I can't even still wrap my head around the fact that this thing still plays NES games so poorly. Even though we've reached a point where NES emulation is just down to a science at this point. Emulating NES games is so easy nowadays, you know, because the NES is like 40 years old. So you could easily play NES games on something like a Game & Watch, or if you want a bigger game library, you know, if you had like a 3DS back in the day, or a Nintendo Switch Online subscription, or just emulate any NES games on, like, say, your phone, or maybe even a very cheap Android tablet. Fact of the matter is, all those devices play NES games way better than this piece of garbage. And it also baffles me that this thing has NES games on here instead of Game Boy games, which this device is trying to rip off from. Like, if you can't even do that correctly, then what's the fucking point? Because, like, the Game Boy is also really easy to emulate, but if this thing can't handle NES all that well, then God forbid how much worse it'll do with Game Boy. Just, yeah. This thing is, it's such a big piece of garbage. I will never understand why stuff like this continue to exist into 2025. Like I said already, we have NES emulation down to a science. Those games are way easier to run nowadays compared to, like, 20 or so years ago. Like, if we were talking, like, trying to play NES games on something like a Game Boy, for example, I could be way more forgiving just because of the fact that, you know, these systems are way less powerful. But nowadays, with how easily we have access to emulators, this kind of stuff is not excusable anymore. And so all of this is doing is just deceiving people into thinking, oh, a new Game Boy, cool, I'll get that, and not even realize that they got ripped off. And while the company that made this piece of shit got to make a couple bucks off of it. Big shame.
So now I think you get a better idea of just what exactly makes the game light so awful. Like I said, it's so bad, it's comical. Like, jeez. It completely baffles me that stuff like this still exists in 2024/2025. If you're gonna go through the effort of making a Game Boy ripoff, at least, I don't know, make it actually fucking play Game Boy games, for Christ's sake! And also improve literally everything else, but at that point, you might as well just get an emulation handheld that will provide a much better experience than this piece of junk. Anyway, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about this piece of garbage that is the Game Light? Definitely be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Also, be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Also, what do you guys think about the style of video from me? I'm kind of trying some new things at the moment. This was literally just an impromptu idea. And I kind of want to do more of these in the future, but also not at the same time because I'd rather not see my money get wasted on garbage like this. But either way, also, one last thing. If you wanted to play NES games right now, which device would you be reaching for? Better not be the Game Boy. I'm on my hands and knees. But either way, that is going to do it for me in this video. I want to thank you all for watching. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. This is District 9900 signing off. Some of you likely got some kind of new console as a present, and I bet you are very, very happy with that console. Unless you have... I can't. me.